I'm 22 female, living with my best friend and roommate, Amy, who is also 22. We've known each other since freshman year, became close fast, and moved in together right after college. You could say we've been each other's support system, sisters almost, in every way. And, like close friends, we can both be a bit opinionated, but generally, we're pretty aligned on most things until now. Amy had been seeing this guy for a couple of months, and it was clear she was head over heels. Every conversation she'd steer back to him somehow, grinning ear to ear as she went on about how kind he was, how considerate, and how he had this way of making her feel special. She'd dated a few people in the past, but none of them had really stuck. Either they weren't serious enough, or they'd end up being more drama than they were worth. But this guy, let's call him Jake, seemed to be her dream come true. From what she told me, he was thoughtful, steady, and made her feel like she'd finally found someone who valued her as much as she valued him. Honestly, it was nice to see her like this. I hadn't seen her so giddy and light-hearted in a long time. She'd always been the more romantic one between us, the kind who would devour rom-coms, sighing about meet-cutes and love at first sight. For once, it seemed like she'd found someone who made her feel like she was living her own romantic comedy, and I was happy for her. Every morning, I'd hear some new detail about the sweet things he'd done. He'd brought her flowers just because, or taken her out for a walk under the stars. It was like she was glowing, and as her friend, I couldn't help but feel a little vicarious joy. We'd have late-night talks about how she could see this going somewhere, maybe even something serious if things kept going this way. She was caught up in it, and truthfully, I was rooting for her. Then, about a week ago, she came to me with this idea that I could feel coming even before she said it. She asked if I'd come along on a double date, her and Jake, and me with one of his friends. She assured me he was single, looking to meet someone, and, in her words, perfect for me. Now, I haven't been super into the dating scene lately. My schedule's packed, and, frankly, the dating burnout is real, but Amy wasn't letting it slide. She argued that I didn't need to be serious about it, that I could just go and have fun. She made the whole thing sound so casual, throwing in, "Come on, at least meet him. What's the worst that could happen?" She assured me that Jake's friend was my type, and apparently, she'd been conspiring with Jake about it, as if they'd engineered the perfect match just for me. Amy was practically bouncing off the walls, convinced I'd be thanking her later. After a few days of her dropping hints and little nudges, I eventually gave in. Her excitement was contagious, and I thought, why not? The worst that could happen was that I'd have an okay dinner and go home with a funny story to tell. She was so thrilled that I'd finally said yes that it felt like she'd been the one who had won a small victory. I decided to go along with it, figuring at the very least, it would make her happy. The night finally rolled around, and we all met up at this cozy, upscale place not too far from where we lived. It was one of those places that was casual enough to feel comfortable, but just fancy enough that cocktails came with a price tag, around $10 to $12 each. I took a deep breath, determined to keep an open mind, to give Amy's setup a fair chance. Jake was friendly, seemed pretty grounded, and I could see what Amy saw in him. He had this easygoing charm that put everyone at ease, like he was genuinely happy to be there, and, by extension, so was his friend. As for the guy Amy set me up with, well, he was nice enough. He was polite, the kind of guy you'd easily bring home to meet your family, and easy to talk to. But the instant chemistry just wasn't there. Still, he was respectful and made a good dinner companion, so we chatted casually. I kept it light, aware that I wasn't looking for anything beyond a good conversation and a pleasant evening. I could feel pretty early on that there wouldn't be a second date, but that was okay. I didn't need fireworks or anything dramatic. I was just there for a night out and to support Amy. The night went by uneventfully until the check arrived. I'd had 2 cocktails, as did Amy, her guy, and his friend. Nothing over the top, just a casual meal with some drinks, the kind you'd expect when everyone's in a relaxed, friendly vibe. I think we'd all assumed the end of dinner would be straightforward, so when the server placed the bill on the table, I glanced at it, fully expecting we'd split it down the middle or each cover our share. It wasn't a particularly pricey place, but it was upscale enough that it wasn't a minor tab either. Then, just as I was reaching for my purse, Amy confidently declared, "Don't worry, our men have got this. The way she said it was almost startling. Her tone had this finality to it, as if this was something she'd already discussed with Jake and his friend and didn't need anyone's input. She had this knowing, assured look, her chin tilted up like she was completely certain this was how things should go. There was a strange shift in the air after she said it, and I felt my shoulders tense a little. This wasn't a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but there was something unsettling about her making the decision for everyone, as though it was simply a given. My first reaction was surprise, maybe even a flicker of awkwardness. It didn't sit right with me. I've always preferred to cover my share, especially on a date where there isn't any chemistry, like tonight. I didn't want to send the wrong message or have anyone think I'd agreed to the evening for a free meal. Plus, to me, it felt a bit outdated to assume men should automatically foot the bill just because they're men. Maybe that's just me, but I've always been the type to keep things equal, financially and otherwise. So, I tried to brush it off and said something casual, like, "Oh, I don't mind splitting if that's easier." I was hoping to defuse the moment, make it clear that this was just my preference, not a judgment on anyone else. But Amy didn't seem to take it that way. She looked over at me, eyebrows raised, and gave me this incredulous look, like I'd just suggested something absurd. She leaned in, almost like she was trying to keep her voice low but failing to mask her annoyance. "This is how it's supposed to be," she insisted, her voice taking on this almost motherly tone, as if I'd forgotten some critical lesson about dating etiquette. For a second, I felt caught between wanting to stand my ground and not wanting to make a scene. Everyone around us seemed to be watching this mini power struggle unfold, and I didn't want to drag things out, especially not in front of Jake and his friend, who now looked a bit uncomfortable. I glanced over at the two of them, and they seemed caught between saying something and just waiting it out, not sure how to weigh in without tipping the scales in one direction or another. The whole thing felt way more awkward than it should have been, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of everyone's eyes on us. "To keep things light," I said, "Hey, I just don't mind splitting," with a small laugh, trying to convey that it really wasn't that big of a deal to me. But Amy wasn't having it. She seemed almost agitated, like I was breaking some unspoken code between us. Her jaw clenched a little, and she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and giving me this look that practically screamed, "Why are you doing this?" It was such a small thing, but the intensity behind her insistence felt overwhelming, and I could tell she wasn't going to let this go easily. The whole thing had escalated from a simple preference to what felt like an unspoken test of loyalty, a test I wasn't even aware I was supposed to pass. The guys, caught in this uncomfortable limbo, exchanged glances and, after a brief pause, agreed to pay, albeit with a hesitancy I could feel. Their tone was polite but uncertain, like they'd been pulled into a performance they hadn't signed up for. After we left, I said goodbye to the friend and walked home alone, assuming the evening had gone about as well as I could have hoped. No harm, no foul, right? Or so I thought. The moment I got home, I kicked off my shoes, grabbed a cup of tea, and settled in, thinking I'd had a decently pleasant night. I wasn't expecting fireworks, and honestly, the evening had been more entertaining than I initially anticipated. I hadn't even thought much about the whole Bill situation by that point, figuring it was just one of those minor, forgettable moments. I was genuinely surprised when, a few hours later, Amy's name popped up on my phone screen, and I opened a text that was anything but friendly. The message from her was blunt, almost startling in its tone. She was furious, saying that I'd ruined the night. I read her words over again, trying to make sense of them. Apparently, Jake had confided in her afterward that he'd been bothered by the whole scene around the bill, especially her comment about real men covering the tab. According to Amy, Jake wasn't thrilled with how things had played out, and now he was rethinking the relationship entirely. He told her he didn't want a girlfriend who always expected men to pay, and her insistence had made him feel pressured and uncomfortable. To hear Amy tell it, it was like this one small moment had unraveled everything she thought she had with him, and she was laying the blame squarely at my feet. I felt a knot forming in my stomach as I kept reading. Amy wasn't just mad, she was accusing me of sabotaging her relationship. She told me flat out that if I hadn't offered to split, none of this would have happened. Her exact words were something like, "If you'd just gone along with it and backed me up, it wouldn't have been a problem." She made it sound like I'd actively undermined her, that I'd done something disloyal by voicing my preference to pay my share. And the idea that this seemingly trivial moment with the bill was enough to create a rift between her and Jake was just shocking. I was honestly speechless. I didn't even know what to say back at first. I kept rereading the text, trying to wrap my head around how she'd come to the conclusion that my decision to split the bill had set off this relationship crisis. We'd never talked about this beforehand. She hadn't mentioned wanting me to play along or side with her on the payment situation. If she'd given me even a heads up, I might have understood where she was coming from. But to me, it was such a minor, inconsequential thing, just an attempt to avoid making Jake's friend feel pressured to pick up the check for someone he barely knew. I couldn't believe it had spiraled into this. The following days at home were excruciating. Amy had gone completely cold. She barely looked at me, her tone clipped and curt when she had to speak, and there was this thick, unspoken tension filling every room. We went through our routines in silence, each breakfast and dinner feeling like I was sitting in a room where the air had turned dense and stifling. I tried a few times to bring it up, to ask her if we could talk this out, but every time I approached the topic, she shut me down before I even had a chance to explain myself. Her responses were painfully brief, like she was carving out as much distance as possible. Eventually, I managed to get out that I genuinely hadn't realized it mattered to her, that I didn't mean to undermine her in any way. But her reply was ice cold, practically sneering, as she told me that I wasn't a girl's girl because, in her eyes, a real friend would have backed her up no matter what. That last comment stung in a way I hadn't expected. I'd always considered myself a supportive friend, someone who would be there for the people I cared about. To have her question that, especially over something so small, something I thought was a non-issue, made me feel a deep, aching hurt. It was like she was saying our friendship, everything we'd built, hinged on whether or not I was willing to play along in this one specific scenario. Update. The days crawled by, each one heavy with the tension that had settled into every corner of our apartment. It was strange. This place we'd made into a home together suddenly felt hostile, like I was an intruder in my own space. Amy had shut down entirely. She wasn't speaking to me at all, except in clipped, almost robotic responses when we couldn't avoid each other. Her silence was cold, deliberate, like she was trying to freeze me out completely, and it hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time, I found myself hesitating to come home after work or class, lingering outside our door, steeling myself to walk in and face the void between us. Every meal we ate separately, every movie night we skipped, it was as if the echoes of our friendship haunted each room. A whole week passed like this. Every day was a constant reminder of the way things had fractured, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had shifted. And not just because of this one dinner bill, it felt bigger than that, deeper. I started replaying moments from our friendship in my head, looking for signs I might have missed or issues that had gone unspoken. I couldn't help but wonder if this one argument had simply cracked the surface on something we'd been silently building up over time. Was there some underlying resentment she'd been holding onto? Or maybe some unspoken tension I hadn't seen until it all came to a head in such a strange, unexpected way. The weirdest part was watching her deal with things with Jake. She was as silent with him as she was with me, refusing to answer his texts or calls. She told me once, in passing, that she was waiting for him to come around, but she said it with a kind of strained confidence, as if trying to convince herself. But he hadn't, at least not from what I could see. Amy's phone would light up occasionally with his name, and she'd just stare at the screen, letting it ring until it stopped, her face unreadable. I could tell she was hurt, even if she was too proud or stubborn to admit it, and a part of me wanted to reach out, to ask if she was okay. But I didn't feel like I had that right anymore, not when she'd practically made it clear that I wasn't the kind of friend she wanted. Then, one night, as I was making dinner, she finally broke the silence in a way that almost felt like a slap in the face. Without any build-up, she looked at me and said, "You've made it obvious you don't support me." Her tone was flat, almost as if she was talking about the weather, but the words cut deep. Support. I thought back to every time I'd been there for her through her previous breakups, through family drama, through job troubles. I'd always been by her side, and yet, here she was, telling me I didn't support her because I wouldn't go along with her expectation that men should pay for everything. It felt so unfair, Like she decided our entire friendship rested on this one narrow idea of loyalty, an idea I didn't even know she held so tightly until now. I wanted to say something, to explain that I did support her, just maybe not in the way she expected this one time. I didn't think support should mean going along with something I didn't agree with, especially when it felt uncomfortable. I would have done it in a heartbeat if she'd just pulled me aside that night and said, "Hey, this matters to me." But she hadn't. She'd thrown me into a situation with assumptions I couldn't have known, and now she was acting like I'd betrayed her by not reading her mind. The next few days blurred together. I couldn't focus, couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I'd been wrong to think we were on the same wavelength. I found myself questioning everything, not just our friendship but my own sense of loyalty, wondering if maybe I'd missed some fundamental rule of friendship. And then, just as I'd started to come to terms with the fact that maybe this was the end of the road for us, Amy reached out to me, but not with an apology or a real attempt to clear the air. It was about the rent. She said she needed to talk, and for a brief moment, I thought she'd come around, that maybe she'd finally seen how much this had all hurt me, too. But when she started talking, it was all practical, logistical. She'd realized that she couldn't afford the rent on her own or find a new roommate on such short notice. She said she wanted to clear the air, but I could tell from the way she spoke that this wasn't about fixing things between us. It was about convenience, about the reality of our living arrangement and her not being able to handle it financially if I left. There was no warmth in her tone, no real regret, just a kind of panicked edge, like she was backed into a corner. I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to just agree, to let it all go and pretend things could go back to normal. But another part of me, the part that had spent a week feeling like an outsider in my own home, knew that I couldn't stay. I couldn't live with someone who saw our friendship as a set of unspoken expectations I could never fully understand or meet. And as much as I hated the thought of leaving, of completely cutting off someone who'd been so important to me, I know I needed time, space, and the chance to find people who actually wanted me as I was, no hidden expectations or rules required. Do you think I should continue to live with her?